What you just heard was an answering machine voicemail connected by law enforcement to a serial killer that terrorized the Sacramento and Rancho Cordova areas of Los Angeles in the 1970s. This serial killer was named the East Area Rapist and also the original Night Stalker, as well as the Golden State Killer. This recording took place years after the rapist, who eventually went on to brutally bludgeon to death 13 people, raped the individual woman he made this phone call to. So this took place after he raped her, years after he raped her. And the reason I bring this call up, is because although this serial killer has never been identified, there is, in my opinion, numerous instances in his attacks, which I will document in the second part of this two-part video, in which his hatred of women, and yes, in this case he actually did, I believe, have a deep-seated hatred for women, but his hatred of women and men as well actually can potentially give clues to his motivations and thus potentially help someone, somewhere, to apprehend him at some point if he's indeed still alive. Age estimates from his victims put him around 20 years old, mid to late 20s, so he could be right now in his 60s and 70s, if he's alive. This may take a while, because in discussing my speculations on the killer, I will also speculate on male violence and how I believe a specific aspect of male violence is pinged, unfortunately, to maternal abandonment, and in a wider sense, paternal abandonment as well. So again, I'll be breaking this video up into two parts, and part one is where the groundwork is laid for why I believe that it is very possible that the East Area Rapist suffered trauma and parental abandonment in his childhood, and why that led to his extreme hatred of women. So I have to apologize for not giving too many details in this first part of the video about this extremely fascinating case. But again, I want to explore here the type of childhood abuse and parental abandonment that I will argue transfers later in life to a fear of female abandonment in general, and I think this can help to explain actual concepts such as toxic masculinity. Not the toxic masculinity that feminists insist exists and permeates our culture, but the actual thing itself. The man who snaps after internalizing anger over rejection or abandonment by a woman, starting with his mother, and culminating after with a wife or girlfriend, or even in many cases an innocent sex worker who unfortunately bears the brunt of a killer's projection. This channel has always maintained and always will maintain that the genders are in fact governed by evolutionary drives that allow us to make with some degree of certainty predictions about the way each gender will behave in the aggregate. We have often said here that women tend to do this, or men tend to do that, and I stand by these generalizations and wholeheartedly believe that without them, we could not have a functioning society. I do maintain that these generalizations become unacceptable in the event that one seeks to do violence against individuals of a gender based on those generalizations, and this applies to women generalizing men, and of course vice versa. But again, I want to reiterate, especially with all the violence that we've been experiencing as of late, that we can infer some conclusions on male violence against women that can help us both prevent it and predict it. And this not only helps the women who would eventually become victims of violence at the hands of these men, it of course helps the men as well who would forfeit their freedom by doing the violence, or perhaps forfeit their lives after law enforcement responds to a violent incident they initiated over something as insignificant as female rejection. I will finally reiterate one more time that there exist many feminist and even non-feminist institutions that seek to conflate my desire to understand male violence with their convoluted and hateful rhetoric about men as a whole, and I will take this moment to unequivocally distance myself from such persons and organizations. The study of male violence is not and should never be an indictment of the male sex. The study of male violence is, at least from my perspective, part of the never-ending struggle to create an opportunity for men to better understand themselves and thus understand the world around them. The idea is to help men who would become violent to not be violent by better understanding themselves. This is my intention. Any attempts to connect it to anything else is explicitly not the intention of this talk. I want to start with a case that has fascinated me over the years, but that is only now gaining notoriety due to the popularization of the case by Netflix's Mindhunter series, based on the book of the same name written by FBI profiler Johnny Douglas. I'm talking about the case of the nearly 7-foot-tall behemoth, Edmund Kemper, otherwise known as the co-ed killer, who from 1964 to 1973 murdered 10 people, many of whom were college co-eds, but the most significant murder he committed was that of his domineering mother, Emil Kemper. I find, unfortunately, way too often, when reading about the often tragic childhood of boys who later go on to become serial murderers, that a perfect storm of dysfunction surrounds the child during adolescence and brews and stews and never becomes truly resolved until it explodes in visceral and sustained acts of violence later in adulthood. Kemper grew up with an extremely intimidating and domineering mother and a weak, passive father, and this, as you will see, played a major factor in Edmund's later crimes. And again, I wish to try to make the case that this type of absent or weak father, coupled with a dominant, controlling mother, is a recipe for increased male criminality. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll agree with me. Kemper's father, Edmund Kemper II, was a World War II veteran who later went on to provide his family with a comfortable existence on an electrician's salary. But despite this, Edmund's mother, Clarnell, derided him, accusing him of his employment being, quote, menial and not enough to satisfy her. Despite the fact that he was providing for the entire family, it seems that Clarnell Kemper believed that her husband's job did not hold enough status for her liking. Before he obtained gainful employment as an electrician, however, Kemper II worked, of all things, as a nuclear weapons tester in the Pacific Proving Grounds after his stint in World War II. And in order to give you an idea of the type of marital relationship that Kemper II, or Kemper Sr., if you want to call him that, had with Clarnell, he was later quoted as stating that, quote, suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her, end quote. And he also claimed that the impact of married life with Clarnell impacted him, quote, as a grown man more than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did, end quote. So Edmund Kemper's father would have rather faced combat in a war zone than to live with this woman. I want to really drive that point home. And I really hope that you guys understand how toxic that environment can be. I want to leave no doubt here that I believe Kemper Jr. had some aspect of his being, something hereditary and genetic that was simply wrong, something congenital that predisposed him to antisocial and violent behavior. The murders he committed were violent in the extreme, and he had a history of animal abuse at a very early age, as well as a great many violent fantasies he cultivated from childhood all the way up to the age of 14 when he committed his first murders, which were an act of, and I don't know if this is a real thing, but I guess you could call it grand matricide or parricide. And that is to say that he killed his grandmother and grandfather in that particular homicide. However, there were several key developments in his childhood and adolescence that I believe made whatever violence he was predisposed to exhibit itself in a much more frequent and extreme way. I'm going to go ahead and raise the possibility that if several key watershed moments had not occurred in Edmund's life, and if those moments weren't supplemented with an almost non-stop campaign of abuse directed at Edmund by his mother Clarnell over the course of years, some or even all of his murders may not have been committed. I want to further stress that Kemper is a bit of an anomaly among serial killers in that he, after committing his final murder, that of his mother Clarnell, voluntarily turned himself in at a point where the investigations on the part of law enforcement into the murders he committed had not even the slightest inkling that he could be the culprit. He was, to my knowledge, never once considered a suspect, and so unlikely to be considered a suspect by the police officers whom he confessed to, whom, by the way, were well acquainted with Edmund, that they actually hung up the phone on him when Kemper confessed, thinking the entire confession was some sick or bad practical joke, and Kemper later called them back and reconfessed after that, and this time with directions to where they could find his mother's body, and only then did they come to arrest him. After years of marital discord and abuse, Edmund Sr. and Clarnell Kemper finally divorced, and this was, in a word, devastating to Kemper Jr., who adored his father and had always craved his love and affection. Unfortunately, after this divorce, Clarnell received custody, surprise, surprise, that is Kemper and his two sisters, and Kemper Sr. moved and eventually started a new family with another woman. I've uploaded previously videos that describe a process called spousification. That is where, in the case of an absent father, the mother will commit a form of emotional incest with her male children. And this is to say that she will prop him up as a surrogate husband, either seeking emotional or even monetary support from her son, since his father is no longer there to provide it for her. Something like this dynamic seems to have occurred with Clarnell and Edmund Kemper after her divorce, where she constantly ridiculed Kemper Jr. for being, quote, just like his father, and in the process of this happening, she seemed to relentlessly shit-test her own son, making sure to deride and ridicule him every time he didn't meet up to his mother's impossible expectations for what a proper man should be. Kemper himself often blamed his urges to kill women on the unceasing campaign of abuse his mother hurled at him for how much he looked like and reminded her of his father, and one of 3 of her ultimately failed marriages. Clarnell Kemper almost certainly projected her hatred of men as a whole onto her only son, and during his childhood and early adolescent years, one of the key events that I believe precipitated and made his homicidal tendencies ultimately much worse, and thus much more likely to eventually be acted out upon, occurred. Clarnell feared that Kemper, at 8 years old, would molest and rape his sisters, and insisted that Edmund sleep in a dimly lit basement with one naked bulb for lighting every night, while his mother and his sisters slept in the comfort and warmth of the upstairs bedrooms. Whenever Edmund protested about this, he would get slapped and be called a wimp for it. So already, his mother was trying to get him to, man up by essentially making him a gendered second-class citizen in his own home, while at the same time justifying it by placing the blame on the inherent rapiness of his budding masculinity. Now, at 8 years old, the pitch-black cold basement isn't exactly the most inviting scenario. You could imagine that this terrified the young Edmund Kemper. But I want to stop and help you visualize here. Kemper, had behavioral issues to say the least, but he was also extremely intelligent, genius level in fact. His IQ was measured at 145. And as such, I think that it would serve us much better to see his description of the daily ritual of being lowered down into this dungeoned domicile he was imprisoned in. And when I say imprisoned in, I'm not being hyperbolic. His mother literally padlocked him in the basement every night. So let's listen to how Kemper describes this.
Death with one of your sisters.
My younger sister, yeah. My older sister was 5 years older than me, so she was off with her friends and in a distant relationship. My younger sister's 2 years younger, and I developed some morbid games. My life had started going that way at about 8. We lived in a house where there was a basement. Some people think there was a trap door on that basement. That's not so. That was a different house. It was a walk-in basement, but it was in Montana. It was a full basement, had granite walls, hewn wood floorboards, and it looked like some old dungeon out of a castle or something. I was 8 years old, 7.5, 8 years old, and then I was very susceptible. My imagination was very livid. And there was an old furnace in the basement that had been converted from burning coal to burning coal and wood to burning gas. And it had a central heating system with your typical radiators. And if you've ever lived in a home like that, you know the binging, the clang, the pop, the rattles, the weird sounds in the night that can be spooky to a kid. Well, at a certain time of the evening, the family left the center room, the living room of the house. My mother and my sisters, or my sisters themselves, would go up to bed upstairs, where I used to go to bed, upstairs. I had to go down to the basement. And an 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reason in that. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, they're going to heaven. Earth is the living room. I'm going down to deal with demons and monsters and ghosts and all the things that scare me. They don't have to. There's a house with 3 women and 1 male, 1 boy, me. And I got a little defensive. I'm saying, gee, this is kind of ganging up. My older sister had a basement bedroom, okay, and it was a storage room that was about 18 feet wide and 35 feet long, okay, and it was a concrete room, no windows. And it had a light bulb over a big industrial iron sink, like a laundry sink, and had a pull string on the light. The bed was in the opposite corner of the room. It was a double bed, a single bed. And I had a dresser halfway. I had a couple of carpets thrown on the floor, old carpets, and there's a lot of storage stuff along the wall. And I was there about 6 months in that room. And I developed some very, very particular and articulate rituals that I felt I had to go through to protect myself. Again, it's embarrassing. I was a youngster, and if you can imagine me going down a staircase of rough-hewn wood, there's no guardrail, so one step wrong and you're off into this black pit. I turn on the light, it's a little circular light switch, and a single naked bulb goes on down at the bottom of these stairs, okay? So I turn that light on, I open the door, I close the door because my mother complains of the cold coming in from the basement. I go down the stairs, I get to the bottom, I do a 180-degree turn, and I walk the full length of the house on this floor with these pipes rattling and wheezing and banging over my head. It's pitch black ahead of me, and the only light is behind me hanging down from the ceiling. I'm now cut off from the house, cut off from them. I walk this full length into the darkness, from this gradients of light into complete darkness, groping around in the dark. I do about a 45-degree angle when I get to the end. And I pull the string and it lights up this end. And then I'm supposed to walk all the way back to the other end, turn that light off, and now walk toward the light from the dark. And I've got this horrible terror going on inside of me. And this is every night. This is every day because it's pitch black down there, no windows. She didn't intend all of this. And when I sniveled about it, when I complained and I cried about it, I got smacked in the head. You know, what's the matter with you? Quit being such a wimp. And she, you know, she was trying to solve a problem. She had not enough room upstairs to where I didn't have to share a bedroom with a sister. I'm 8 years old. I need to go to the basement.
So we saw several things here. At first, if you listen closely, you could detect a bit of resentment coming through in his voice when he said that his sisters would ascend upstairs where, quote, he used to sleep. And if you caught that, he refers, of course, to where he used to sleep when his father still resided in their home. He splits his formative childhood years up between when his father was present versus when he left, as any child should in that situation. And then, of course, he has now begun to associate the abandonment from his father with when the rejection from his mother, his sisters, and the female sex in general occurred. He also has begun to pedestalize women, seeing his sisters as ascending to heaven while he was being banished to hell, to the dungeon, all on the order of his mother, who would slap him if he complained about it, and who would at other times refuse to show him any kind of physical affection for fear of, quote, turning him gay, end quote. And it was in this extremely fertile environment for dysfunction that Edmund was simply left to stew, a child who already likely had a genetic predisposition for violence. In fact, the young, attractive college co-eds that Kemper killed before the culmination of his murders with his final act of matricide were said to have been committed according to Edmund because he was, quote, essentially killing his mother over and over again, which again seems to be why he turned himself in after finally killing her. Clarnell had the unfortunate habit of telling Edmund over and over that he could never attain the pretty beautiful college co-eds at the university where she worked. So, as you would imagine, the constant abuse and ostracization of Kemper on the part of his divorced mother created a young adolescent male that was equal parts angry, confused, and lacking in confidence. And this essentially stifled his male inquisitiveness in the beginnings of his adolescent years. He goes on to describe this, actually.
From my point of view, what I saw was there was a great hole in my life. There was a lot missing from my life, and it didn't necessarily mean feelings. It meant I had walled off this emptiness in my life, okay? I had an upbringing that was, some have called dysfunctional, okay? Parents divorced when I was young. My mother started drinking heavily. She was working to raise 3 kids. We were not being cooperative about it. She drank more, she punished us harder, probably out of desperation. So character sets were being developed at that point. Rather than me going to Boy Scouts and getting achievement badges, I was not going to Boy Scouts and not getting achievement badges. I was finding devious ways to get around the rules of the home. Because the whole home life, I watched it deteriorate from what typical kids on the block were doing to coming home from school that I didn't like anyway. And ironically, I have a high IQ. I didn't know that till I was locked up the first time for murder. I always thought I was a little missing up here, a little short. Because I was always called stupid, I was called slow, don't you think when you do things? That was the problem. I wasn't thinking when I did things. I just did by rote, I did by memory, I did by example. And I had absolutely no faith in myself at all. I had no interaction going on in my own mind. I was not a thinker. I was not an individual. I had a teacher in the 9th grade who changed all that. He made me think. He would not tolerate my not thinking. He was an art teacher. And it was a devastating experience for me because there were gears in my head that were just rusty and they were barely moving or not at all. And that's when I found out that's what the state of my mind's functioning was. I didn't think. To the point of he points at a stapler on his desk and says, "What does that say?" And I looked at it and I said, "Silver line." He says, "Look again." And he's raving at me. And I look and it said swing line. All I had to do was look at it and read it. But I glanced at it and threw it back at him out of panic. So he made me think, and he gave me puzzles to work out in school in my class where I had to resolve these to continue on with the class. I had to think. I had to use abstracts. And after that started, that became fascinating to me, so I got more and more involved in thinking and about my surroundings and things like that, but by then I was locked up.
Okay, so here we see a few things, and again, take this with a grain of salt. I want to remind you that these are the words of a charismatic, high IQ psychopath about the mother he murdered, whom of course is not there to defend herself. These people excel at psychological manipulation, but I do also wish to say that a great many of the details Kemper is currently relegating here are actually corroborated by the people who picked apart his claims. In his book, FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas, the originator of the FBI's famed criminal profiling division, expresses similar points to the ones expressed here, stating the very real possibility that Kemper's violent impulses could have very well been abrogated by the simple presence of a normal and loving upbringing, especially one where his father is present. I sincerely believe that Kemper was smart enough so that he could continue killing if he really wanted to, at least for a very long time, before he was caught. In terms of the question of whether or not we are being manipulated by this individual, I sincerely believe that these are not after-the-fact rationalizations because if you remember, Kemper turned himself in after he killed his mother. If he really wanted to simply elicit sympathy for his crimes after the fact, and if all of this psychobabble about his mother being responsible for his violent impulses was just after-the-fact rationalization, then he could have just continued killing co-eds and not have chosen to kill his mother and turn himself in, and he would possibly still be free today or have gone on to kill for a very long time before he was apprehended. It should be noted that after killing his grandparents at the age of 14, Kemper was remanded to the Atascadero State Hospital in California, wherein he was able to endear himself to the California Youth Authority psychiatrist tasked with his rehabilitation, to the point where at the age of 21, only 7 years later, they deemed him fit to re-enter society. This is somebody who was able to fool the psychiatrists that were analyzing him after killing his grandparents into believing that he was perfectly rehabilitated. They let him go into the custody of his mother and gave him a clean bill of psychological health. He also insinuated himself into the local law enforcement communities so as to hide in plain sight and divert suspicion away from himself, and at the same time get details on the investigation into the murders he was committing. So someone with a genius level IQ who could go out of their way to do all of these things to divert suspicion away from him, who could trick the psychiatrist tasked with determining whether or not he was a threat to society into giving him a clean bill of health, after committing the crime of double murder, could have certainly figured out a way to keep on killing for a very long time. He chose instead to confess. So yes, I think that Kemper is actually being truthful here. I can't get into his mind, but I believe him. But in this clip, what we are beginning to see here are the effects of maternal, verbal, and physical abuse on the self-confidence of young boys, and I think that what Kemper truly craved was just a male role model, like the teacher he described, to tell him that it was okay to explore, that it was okay to think for himself, that it was okay to engage in explorative thoughts that boys so often do, especially in an environment where it wouldn't be shouted down by a domineering maternal figure. This, unfortunately, is what begins to happen when a boy is constantly ridiculed by the most important female figure in his life, his mother. He shuts down, he retreats inside himself, and goes into survival mode where all risk is mitigated, and that's why he wouldn't think. Thinking for yourself involves a component of risk, right? So again, this creates a dynamic where he would never think to smile or inquire, or most importantly, defend himself. Boys like this will grow up with a fear of women, and there's a significant chance that they will never overcome this fear. I've said this quote in a previous video, but I think that in no point in the dozens of hours of content on this channel has it been more apt. Men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them. What they don't tell you, of course, is that many times women like Clarnell Kemper will make it their business to laugh at and ridicule men so much that there seems almost to be a counterintuitive attempt to defend against male violence by trying to stamp it out with ridicule. And of course, it is not right for a man to visit violence on a woman simply because she ridicules him. But there are women out there who almost derive a sick pleasure from it. And these types of women, yes, I'll say it, very often have a role in creating violent men when they are charged with the rearing of boys without a father figure present. Keep in mind that Clarnell Kemper was, along with her husband, responsible for the genetic traits that Kemper inherited. That is, she was a large woman, over 6 foot tall, with an acid tongue, high intelligence, a hatred for the opposite sex, and a particular penchant for dressing down men with her words. Kemper described his mother's abilities for male emasculation in detail. Now, I want you to keep in mind that at this point, Kemper is describing what would occur after he spent years in the Atascadero psychiatric facility when he was, despite vehemently insisting that he not be, paroled to live with his mother upon his release at the age of 21.
As my relationship, I was paroled to my mother, okay? What these experts don't notice in the picture, I haven't seen it in writing anywhere, it could be somewhere, that when I was 14 years old, I ran away from my mother. They mention that. But if you look at it in the overall picture, why did I run away? I wanted to be with my father. That's a very topical approach to it. I wanted to get away from my mother because I was dreaming, thinking, fantasizing murder all day long. I couldn't get it out of my head. She and I couldn't battle with her because I was very intimidated by her. She's 6 feet tall, she weighs 2 1/4, 225 pounds. She's not a fat woman, she's just this great big woman who I was terrified of. She had verbal capabilities you wouldn't believe. I used to watch her field strip grown men in emotional little contests. And when they get to a point where they wanted to smack her, then she started attacking them on beating women. Oh, slap the woman around, you know. And then she'd toy with them on that. And I'd watch these guys dance around the room having fits, knocking out windows, punch a hole in the door, and stomp off. And she could control people like that. I'm sitting there watching that in awe from the one point of view and in terror from the other. I grew up with this stuff. She did that to my dad when they were always battling before the divorce. I'm not trying to put on her what happened to the girls or to her, but I'm saying there was a lot of psychological involvement there. I got it in the legs. One time I turned around shrieking and she hit me in the mouth, and the little keeper on the clasp flew off, little silver buckle thing. And she smacked me. This thing breaks off on my mouth, right? She hits me across the face with this belt and says, "Shut up, the neighbors are going to think I'm beating you." I'm looking at her, what? You know? I'm not supposed to cry out, which is a natural reaction to these great red welts that are going on me. I was a little shit. I got rude downstairs. She took me upstairs and beat the hell out of me. I would like to think it was a better part of my character that was resisting this kind of pressure to fit into some mold that she had the image of as being the good little kid. I'll be damned if I'm going to be that good little kid. I'm getting the hell beat out of me for not being that little kid. I got I don't know what you call it, resistant to it. But again, it's not in manly ways or in prideful ways. It was sneaky little devious ways. I'd get around that. And one of the ways was, she won't give me an allowance, I'll take money out of her purse. I never robbed her, took all of it. I'd take a dime here, a quarter there, 15 cents there, 50 cents here. She comes in drunk at night, she's not going to know how much change she has. So to rebound on that, she started counting her money at all kinds of odd times to keep on top of me. And it was like a game we played for years. At the age of 13, she finally lets me go visit my father, okay, down in LA, where I was born. I'm in Montana where she was born. I don't like Montana. It's cold in the winter, it's hot in the summer, it's miserable, and the people up there are nice people, but hey, they're not my people. That's what I'm saying now. I wasn't viewing or voicing those things then. I was feeling them, but I didn't know how to put them into words. So I finally get to come down and see my dad again, down in LA, all right, 1 month. I never touched her purse again. That scared her. That really bothered her, because she'd beat me halfway senseless with that belt, trying to impress, and in terror tactics. Okay, we're going to eat dinner and I'm going to beat your ass afterwards, you know, so I could think about it for a half hour. Or after some little thing she's doing. And she tried psychological tactics. She tried, I'm going to put you in an orphanage, I'm going to disavow you, and none of that shit worked. So I go see my dad for 30 days. And my stepbrother and I, we go out and mow lawns. We say, gee, Dad, you're going out to dinner tonight, can we go someplace and eat? And he says, sure. He'd give us a few dollars. We'd go down to some little diner down the street. He treated us like little men, like he wanted to be treated by he came from a matriarchal household too. I guess if you know how that stuff runs in families, right? Matriarchal household, the son goes out and finds a mother image and marries her. Well, I didn't know all this stuff back then. It would have made a lot more sense, right? But I got this domineering grandmother on my father's side. I got this domineering grandmother on my mother's side who died before I was born, but now she's reincarnated in my mother and her sister, my aunt. They're two very domineering, very aggressive, very successful women. Okay, so these two women are in terrible conflict with each other, competition, you know, and they didn't get along at all. All right, so I'm in the middle of that, trying to find my way, and I go stay with my dad, and I can only say he reflected back on his childhood and said, gee, I wish I'd been treated this way. So that's how he treated me and my stepbrother, and we responded to that. We'd go, if we needed spending money, we would go out and we'd do tasks around the neighborhood, clean yards, rake this, mow that, water the flowers, and make a few dollars, and we'd have some fun. Okay, and then sometimes he'd ask us to do something. We'd do it because he was always fair with us, and kind, and he was generous with us. So 30 days of doing this opened up whole new feelings in me that I'd never had before. And I wish I'd had more experience with my father growing up.
Now here, in this clip, is when Kemper really starts to illustrate just how much the lack of his father figure created an environment where he felt the need to escape his mother's abuses. He mentions how his mother would beat him senseless with a belt to try to keep him from stealing from her purse, and she even threatened to put him in foster care, but no matter what she did, he would keep stealing and keep misbehaving and keep acting out. But after he spent 30 days with his father, he never again touched her purse. He then talked about how his father would treat him and his brother like little men, instilling masculinity in them by trusting them with money and giving them money to go out to a diner by themselves, giving him a measure of freedom in his life. Kemper even saw this as his father's way of trying to escape his own matriarchal upbringing, and that's very fascinating. How it just takes a father's touch of discipline, and how that can so quickly instill behavior correction in a young boy, when his mother's attacks and beatings could do no such thing for years. There was a famous study done into male elephant delinquency, which showed that juvenile delinquent male elephants, who were going around attacking tourist vehicles and killing rhinos, were doing so because of the fact that the adults had all been killed by humans, thus depriving them of the tempering effects that stronger, older male bull elephants would inject into their society. Once older bull elephants were introduced, the attacks dwindled and ultimately stopped altogether. Of course, I'm not comparing elephants to humans here, but I am asking the question of whether or not in the mammalian animal kingdom, and specifically amongst humans, if fatherhood has a stabilizing effect on male juvenile delinquency. And Kemper keeps exploring these themes later on in the video.
Even adults, I mean, they talk in various relationships how we have our darker side, and there's things that you have thought, as an example, that you'd never want to share with anybody because they're so cruel or they're so unspeakably out of sync with what's going on that you would be too ashamed to share it with someone. Like, boy, I'd like to knock his head off, or I'd like to kill this guy, or she's such a bitch, you know. We all do that. I didn't know that. So I'm adding to the problem, the impetus of this negative orientation. I must be really evil little kid because I'm thinking all these horrible things. I was thinking of them in increasing amounts and increasing frequency, so it's a kind of conditioning. And negative conditioning that I wasn't aware of other than effect. I noticed that if I worked on a certain scenario, a certain kind of patterning in my fantasies, right, after a while it became numb, it became insignificant, it became not enough. So I had to add embellishments to it, a new level. And it just, very subtle, but over many, many years, it just kept going more and more. I've known young people that I've been able to talk to honestly, and knowing them well enough and friendly enough over enough years, share with me, because it was of real importance to me, to know where I dove off the deep end. And they would admit that sometimes and they went off into happier orientations. They had a period where they went off into some real morbid or negative fascinations, but they grew out of it, quote unquote, grew out of it. It stopped providing a service that they needed. It stopped filling a hole or a gap, or let's say an adult came along and started sharing something with them or showed them a new avenue of acting out that completely obliterated that need or vacated it, and they let it go. I didn't. The adult wasn't there. My mother was there. She was there to beat me. She was there to humiliate me. She was there to use me as an example of how inferior men are. And that was a great little lady there. She kind of preceded this female movement we have now of getting rights, of getting equal rights, of getting equal standing, of getting equal presence in various theaters.
But actually you had experimented...
Oh, I was finding out the hard way what women's rights and women's antagonism. I mean, women are drove about things like that. They get upset about the belittlements they get and the lack of equality that they have, that they experience. Unfortunately, my mother developed, and it's not fair to talk about a dead person that way. They can't defend themselves. They can't give you another perspective on what really happened. I can only surmise to try to be fair. Looking back on it, I'm seeing that she was making an effort to balance her pain with what she was experiencing. And if you look at her dad, he's a wimp. He never did anything. Mom did everything, you know, so she orientated toward her. So she comes out doing that stuff. I find out in sociological studies and psychological studies, that's normal. Not necessarily healthy, but that happens. And my dad, being the wimp out of his family, goes and finds my mom, who's the dynamo out of her family, and they get married, and it'll either work or it won't. And in his case, it didn't work because she kept hammering on him. She wanted him to change this. She wanted him to change that, and he couldn't handle that. After 13 years, he'd had enough. What I resented was I had a mother, I had a father. Father worked, he brought in a big paycheck. We had a nice house, we had friends, we went to school, right? We had birthdays, we had Christmas, we had vacations. He had Saturday night with the poker buddies out in the guest house by the garage. We were living pretty good. And she absolutely hated that. This stereotypical response of this deadhead, this muttonhead she's married to, of wanting to go out and play cards in a smoke-filled room, drinking beer and with these old war buddies. See, I had another problem. My father was in the 1st Special Service Force in World War II. They did a book and a movie called The Devil's Brigade. He was a combat sergeant in that group. And he volunteered for that as a single man. They would not take married men. That's how my parents met. She was working as a secretary in Helena, Montana, the capital city. He's a few miles out of town at an old, retired, closed-down cavalry fort for the U.S. Army that was reopened as a secret base for these guys to train out of at Fort William Henry Harrison, just outside of town. They got to know each other. They quite, it wasn't secretly, but it was very quietly got married, because if they'd have known he got married, he'd have been kicked out of the group. This is what was described as a suicide brigade. 5,000 men trained in all these devastation ways, right? He goes off to war, and he does some horrible things. He can't talk about those things.
So here, Kemper talks about how he's been asked by people, when did he go off the deep end? Kemper also says that many other individuals confided to him that they had this period in their youth, where they also had dark fantasies, and there was this period where they were nursing these fantasies, but eventually an adult came along, a mentor came along, and gave them an avenue to express their darker desires in a healthy way that would sometimes even obliterate the previous darkness. Maybe an adult came along and got them into hunting, or boxing, or mixed martial arts, or any of these things that could potentially be the darkness replacer Kemper is speaking about. But Kemper then argues that he never had that adult to steer his dark desires away with a substitute activity. In fact, his mother just ridiculed him and gave him a literal dungeon for him to cultivate those fantasies in. Now, the next thing I'm about to say is going to earn me a ton of flack from my viewers. I'm going to be accused of being, quote, just like the feminist. I'm going to be accused of being a biological determinist. But I'm going to say it anyway. And I'm just reiterating what I said in the beginnings of this video, really. I believe that toxic masculinity exists. I believe that the name we give to it is an inaccurate one. But but I believe that the phenomenon is real. I believe that instead of toxic masculinity, it should be called something along the lines of wayward masculinity. This is to say that there is something within masculinity that is potentially destructive and violent, but that doesn't have to be. If you want proof of this, just look at how boys just take to playing cops and robbers. Look at how boys want to take risks and compete and be in conflict with each other, even if that conflict is just simulated. They want to challenge, they want to be in an adversarial state with other boys, they on average are more likely to want to play with toy guns, and later on in adulthood, they're more likely to want to possess real weapons. They're more likely to enjoy World War II documentaries. They're more likely to be fascinated with war and things of that nature. And that does not mean that they are evil, however. That means that they are normal boys who are exploratory, and part of that exploration are topics of morbidity and aggression and violence. I remember as a young boy, right, we did the typical activities that young boys did regarding animal abuse. We used a magnifying glass on some ants. We killed some daddy longlegs, right? Things that, of course, now, today, as an adult, I look back on with shame. You know, I'm ashamed of doing this, even in my childhood when I really didn't know any better. But I believe, and this is going to be a controversial statement, I believe that we did these things as young children because we didn't know what it would feel like to kill something. We didn't know what it would feel like to cause suffering. And as inquisitive boys, we wanted to know. And there was a part of us that had a desire to know what that would feel like. So we found what our young minds deemed as the most unimportant and disposable forms of life, insects, and we then inflicted that suffering. And I believe for many normal boys, this is a normal part of development. In fact, things like this, I believe, are key milestones we reach in our development of empathy. It is to the child's mind the most inconsequential suffering it can inflict, and thus, after learning what suffering is, the normal adolescent boy begins to understand naturally that he doesn't want to inflict suffering any longer, and most certainly not on the life forms that are closer in similarity to ourselves. And so it ends there and never graduates to cats or dogs or even eventually to people. And for the record, in adulthood, I take the stand of not harming any life forms, insects included. If I see a harmless insect, I go out of my way to simply remove it back into the wilderness. I won't harm even an insect now. But this is why I think the normal adolescent boy never graduates to harming mammals like dogs or cats and simply kills some insects as a child and moves on. Kemper, however, was not normal. He tortured and killed several cats and other animals. The signs were certainly there, and again, I make the argument that his mother eagerly cultivated those warning signs. So in this clip, Kemper really makes some salient points about children and how they orient themselves to whom they perceive as the more stable parent, and how his mother, who herself grew up seeing Edmund's domineering grandmother berate his passive grandfather, Clarnell chose to also marry a passive man. And yet Kemper also describes how the few expressions of masculinity Edmund's father did exhibit, the stereotypical smoke-filled room and the poker game with his old World War II buddies, enraged Clarnell Kemper. Because how dare he exhibit masculinity that didn't include or serve her? And what I find more fascinating is the juxtaposition that we find so often with these types of men. That Kemper's father was this badass World War II veteran that joined up on this so-called suicide brigade. He could handle combat missions that he was statistically unlikely to survive, but he couldn't handle confronting Edmund's mother. Isn't that interesting? Now, I honestly believe that while part of the process of a father raising boys involves teaching them how to handle adversity in the real world, or teaching him a trade, or, how to change a tire, what is too often not transmitted by fathers to their young boys is how to stick up against and defend themselves against women, because a lot of fathers never learn how to do it themselves. And the first opportunity to observe his father in action regarding this, for a boy, is when he is in conflict with his wife, when he is in conflict with the boy's mother. Unfortunately, many men are either unprepared or unwilling to instill this lesson into their sons. Not by anything crazy like abusing their wives in front of their children or anything like that, but by simply standing up for themselves when their wives abuse them. Most boys never get to see their father do that. Now, I want to stop talking about Kemper here for a few reasons. First, his case is so fascinating, and he has conducted so many interviews providing insight into why he did what he did that frankly I could go on for hours and hours attempting to analyze him. But I don't, however, want to end my discussion on him without stressing the gravity of his crimes. It is very easy to sit here and watch him try to explain away what he did, but the fact is that he murdered many innocent girls, he mutilated them, decapitated some of them, he practiced necrophilia on them. He was a deeply, deeply, and profoundly disturbed individual. His murders culminated with him beating his mother to death with a hammer, decapitating her, using her severed head as a dartboard, and then as a sexual plaything. The gravity of crimes like this should never, ever be minimized. I simply believe that Kemper was a deeply disturbed individual who was absolutely born with a hereditary predisposition to violence, which was aggravated greatly by his mother, and I think that we can learn from him. I think that he should be locked away forever, and the only reason I don't believe he should be given the death penalty is because I think it is impossible to fairly mete it out, and thus oppose it on principle. I want to, in conclusion, state that I am in no way saying that Kemper is solely a product of his environment. There are a number of studies that show that there can be a genetic factor that seems to potentiate the likelihood that a child who is abused in childhood will go on to have violent or antisocial tendencies in adulthood. Linked in the description box is a specific study showing that children with low active monoamine oxidase A gene are more likely to be criminally violent in adulthood if they are abused in childhood than people who have a high active version of the same gene. I'm not saying that this was or wasn't the case with Kemper, but I believe that the unfortunate story of Edmund Kemper was a result of nature and nurture. This does not change the fact that we can potentially prevent these scenarios from ending in violence by simply changing what we can control, which is, of course, the way these children are reared. Since we are stuck with our genes, what is important to stress here is the severe impact that parental abandonment and subsequent parental abuse from the parent who is left with custody is what really matters. Now, on this channel, I talked about the concept of male mother need, which is a concept that I started using years ago to describe the intense need for maternal comfort that adult heterosexual, and to a less documented extent, homosexual men experience. The difference in which this manifests itself for heterosexual as opposed to homosexual men is a topic for another video, and for this talk, I would like to keep it isolated to the heterosexual adult male, because we will be addressing the way that this dynamic, this need for maternal comfort and access, when adulterated, can create a dysfunction that very often gives rise to the types of males that can be categorized as female lust killers. I feel that my content has up until this point given a very incomplete picture of this concept of male mother need, because up until this point, it has largely stuck to describing the after effects of male mother need on adult males regarding their romantic relationships with females that are not their mothers. The mother-son dynamic that creates male mother need needs much more exploration if we are to understand this concept in its entirety. So I'm going to say another thing that's going to earn me a lot of flack here. The mother-son relationship, not to sound too Freudian here, is one in which harmless and specifically not acted upon incestual overtones exist. I want to clearly specify that these overtones are never to be acted upon in normal childhood development. The ideal scenario is for these overtones to exist in early childhood all the way up to young adolescence, after which it will slowly and naturally dissipate over time. We've heard the phrase that a woman's first love is her father. Well, a man's first love is his mother. We all know the extreme damage and destructive behavior exhibited by girls with, quote, daddy issues, as it were. These are girls that in their childhood development did not experience a proper, I guess you could say, divorce from their first love, their father. They either experienced too little love and affection from their father, or they experienced too much, the father that crossed that boundary and acts on these not to be acted upon and borderline subliminal incestuous urges. And again, I'm gonna keep reiterating this. I want to make it clear that I am not advocating incest of any kind here. These are ancestral overtones that exist and in a natural, healthy upbringing are repressed and pushed into the subconscious, never to be explicitly explored. They are there so that when the adolescent finally begins to take an interest in the opposite sex, they have some frame of reference from their father or their mother, depending on what gender they are. And so yes, some thoughts and desires should be taboo for a reason. I believe that incest is a part of the human condition that we are simultaneously prone to engaging in and have at the same time developed a society in which engaging in it is rightly shunned for not just genetic but social reasons. That doesn't mean it's not there. You can see this in the way that mothers and fathers select mates for their daughters. Fathers are super protective of making sure their daughters don't end up being super promiscuous because, well, that carries a whole host of problems with it, like teen pregnancy and STDs, etc. But I also believe that to some degree, they see their daughter's chastity as an extension of their own male virility. They measure their maleness by their daughter's future mate preference. Mothers do something similar with their sons to varying degrees. They want their sons to get women who are a reflection on them. The father wants to prove his virility vicariously through his son, by teaching him sports, or demanding he succeed in whatever he wants to teach him, etc. It is completely normal, I think, to say that a man subconsciously might seek his mother in his mate. It is not completely normal, and in fact abnormal, for a man to take his mother as a mate. Of course, the same is true for women. It is completely normal to say that a woman subconsciously seeks her father in a mate. It is completely abnormal for a woman to seek her actual father as one. Human psychology is, of course, incredibly complex, and some taboos are so strong that instead of being shed throughout our evolution, we simply develop the means to repress them and use the frustration generated from that repression for an overall positive end. Thus, again, it is my belief that part of a healthy attraction to the opposite sex includes using the parent of the opposite sex as a guidepost of what a mate in young adolescence and adolescence should be like. If a father is distant, a daughter will be more likely to crave attention from men in adolescence, oftentimes recklessly so. Likewise, if a mother is distant, or conversely, if a mother is domineering to the point of smothering, this can have extremely destructive effects on how a man interacts with women in romantic relationships in adolescence, and can create what I like to call a revulsion and reverence dichotomy that unfortunately can oftentimes, if the conditions are right, lead to extreme hatred of and or violence toward women. A famous picture comes to mind of a Mexican woman holding up a sign saying, "Ni santas ni putas, solo mujeres." Now, I don't know the background to this image. I vaguely remember it being feminist in origin, and if I'm in fact correct that this image is of a woman of Mexican origin, I would speculate that this woman was one of the many who belonged to several nascent Mexican feminist groups that existed at the time, in an attempt to address what they deemed as sexism against women being ubiquitous in the oftentimes masculine and machismo-centered Mexican culture. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with this sentiment, but it's my best guess as to the origins of it. But the phrase translates in English to, quote, "not saints, not whores, just women," end quote. Despite the many problems present in feminist philosophy, this phrase stuck out to me as a rare kernel of truth in the oftentimes either misinformed or outright hostile and anti-male aspirations of feminist philosophy. I do think men would be much better served by viewing women not as whores or saints, but simply as women. The opposite is, of course, the case. Women would be better served by viewing men not as saints and not as disposable pincushions that shield them from reality, but simply as men. But this image, I think, encapsulates what can happen to a male who was a victim of a dysfunctional relationship with his mother. There exists a reverence and a hatred, and nothing in between. And for the few men that are willing to engage in violence in order to uphold these two contradictory archetypes of the opposite sex, the results can be tragic. And more importantly, I believe, if understood, the results can be stopped. The famous song, Dear Mama by Tupac Shakur, had a lyric in it that encapsulates so much of what I'm saying here, in which he stated that even though his mother was a crack fiend, she was still, in fact, to him, a black queen. In other songs, he blames her for turning his own brother into a crack baby, and yet other times he showers her with praise and he adores her and proudly boasts about being able to send her diamond necklaces in the mail and pay for her rent. In another video of mine, titled How Tupac Became a Feral MGTOW, I show a progression of Tupac going from this state of reverence to this state of revulsion. And that video, if you watch it, clearly demonstrates the dynamic that I'm talking about here. Tupac was experiencing the type of doublethink that all men on some level experience. That is, the struggle between wanting to believe that women are ethereal, goddess-like, and good, with the reality that at times they are in fact capricious, fiendish, abusive, and downright cruel. The red pill that is so often referenced in our common parlance is not understanding this intrinsically, but emotionally. Taking the red pill is finally making peace with this. Red pill rage is the journey toward that destination. when, for example, in Tupac's case, these two archetypes of the female sex are held simultaneously about one's mother, chaos and conflict and antisocial behavior will almost certainly follow in one form or another. The only question is the extent of the behavior, not the appearance of it. Contradictory notions such as this are very difficult to psychologically square for some men, and when it cannot be squared, relief must be found somewhere. Sometimes that relief is found in explosive violence. Some women must be punished, according to these men, for violating their lifelong adherence to a borderline religious unified field theory on the opposite sex. Explosive violence, I believe, is most likely to occur when convenient myths are used to erect identities that will inevitably crash down on top of the individual when reality exerts a correction. Explosive violence visited onto women by male-female lust killers is very often due to men erecting their identity around this Madonna-whore dichotomy. And very often this dichotomy is precipitated and made worse by an absent father. Joel Rifkin, the Long Island serial killer before the current unidentified Long Island serial killer of the same name, killed several prostitutes in the 1980s, and his is an example, I think, that really delves deep into the ability for some of these killers to actually reveal themselves to us, and specifically what wounds they've suffered surrounding parental abandonment. It goes without saying that, of course, not everyone who suffers parental abandonment will go on to commit these crimes, but those prone to extreme violence, whom have whatever mixture of genetics and environment that makes these individuals possible, very likely will. Now, Rifkin grew up with an extremely demanding father who committed suicide when he was in college, and throughout interviews with him, Rifkin goes into this trance-like state, seemingly devoid of empathy and compassion when reimagining the murders he committed. His affect is very matter-of-fact, little to no emotion is displayed, and when he does show a bit of emotion, it's in the form of a macabre gallows humor wisecrack about his victims. He at one point refers to one of his victims as a quote, package, not as a human being whom he murdered, but an object that needed to be disposed of, a piece of trash. But a completely different side of the killer makes itself apparent when discussing his father. In fact, after relegating to us many instances in which he was never actually good enough for his father, you know, how he couldn't catch a football good enough for him, or he couldn't do this good enough for him, or that good enough for him, etc. The only time in his interviews that Joel seems to show actual, genuine emotion is when he clearly is on the verge of tears, when he recalls how hard he was working to prove to his father that he could ace his biology class, and that he believes that his father committed suicide right before the test results as a final act of spite toward him.
I think he timed that cocktail knowing the test was coming. He didn't want to see the failure. And I didn't get the chance to show him that it wasn't a failure.
It is not just male mother need that can have disastrous effects on the male adolescent psyche, but also abandonment by a father, especially if the male adolescent feels as though it is impossible to win the father's approval and affection before that abandonment occurred. This, I believe, is one part of the perfect storm for creating maladjusted adult males, and so I want to discuss with you what I believe these criteria are. As I've tried to illustrate with Edmund Kemper's case, these three criteria, I believe, are parental abandonment by the father, maternal spousification and pseudo-divorce by the mother, and lastly, and the only one we can't do anything about, is genetic predisposition towards psychopathy or psychopathic traits. It is my belief that the most fertile environment for creating such a perfect storm is, as I've previously mentioned, an environment where a male child is raised with a domineering mother and a passive, weak father. The domineering mother can't help it but to pester and abuse the passive, weak father until even he can't take it anymore and leaves. The mother takes the son as a surrogate husband in an act of emotional and sometimes actual incest. The son can't help but see his mother as both his salvation, his object of sexual reverence, and an object of deep disgust who he hates for chasing away his father. The son also begins to hate his father for not rescuing him from the advances of his mother, and as such, he will later in life develop a hatred of women whom he feels will never live up to the idealized archetype of his mother, and he will also have a hatred of men who he perceives as acquiring these idealized versions of the perfect female. We saw this in particular with the mass murderer Elliot Rodger, who hated both men and women for having the ideal relationship he craved with women. So again, I want to quickly discuss some notable examples of this dynamic before moving on. These examples include serial killer Otis Toole, who was horrifically abused during childhood by his religious fanatic mother, who forced him to dress up in girls' clothing and called him Susan. Toole's alcoholic father later abandoned the family, and Toole later befriended the other part of the serial killer duo he eventually would form when he met a drifter by the name of Henry Lee Lucas. Born into a life of extreme poverty in a backwoods shack just outside of Blacksburg, Virginia, to Viola and Anderson Lucas, Henry grew up with an alcoholic double amputee father, who became that way when he, likely in a drunken stupor, lost both of his legs when a train severed them in a railroad track accident. His father then collected disability for his entire life while Viola was left as the main breadwinner. Viola then turned to prostitution as her main source of income, and in what could only end in horrific psychological damage for Henry, took to servicing her johns right on the floor of the backwoods shack, many times in full view of Henry and his father. One can only imagine the type of damage it would do to a young boy to see his mother prostituting herself on the dirty floor of his home while his own disabled father watched powerless to do anything about it. Viola then took up with a pimp who was reportedly given the authority to physically beat and discipline Henry and his amputee father. And much like Otis Toole, Henry's mother would often send him to school in women's clothing in hopes of grooming him to eventually join the family business, as it were, and prostitute him to men and women alike. Henry lost an eye early in childhood in a fight with his brother, and his father eventually died from pneumonia after he was rumored to have ventured out into the cold and passed out while inebriated in the heavy snow outside of his shack to avoid having to watch Viola with one of her johns. After a drunken dispute where Viola Lucas struck her son in front of a tavern, Henry retaliated by stabbing her in the neck with a knife that he claimed he thought was sheathed. He later left the scene but was picked up and charged with murder after his mother died from the injury after a brief hospitalization. It is not known how many people Lucas killed. He was a serial false confessor and at one point confessed to committing over 3,000 murders across the country, a feat that was deemed impossible when taking into account his limited access to transportation at the time of the murders. But Henry nonetheless led detectives to the bodies of several murders he committed and was convicted of killing 11 people. Needless to say, Henry Lee was a profoundly sick and evil man, but it is indisputable, I think, that he never had much of a chance, given the abuse that he had to endure throughout his childhood. Now, I'm not saying that he is not guilty of his crimes, but I will say that had he not suffered these abuses early in childhood, there would at least be a chance that he would have not committed these murders later on in adulthood. Lucas was found dead in his prison cell from heart failure at the age of 64. South African killer Moses Sitole, whose father died when he was 5 and was later abandoned by his mother and sent along with his siblings to an orphanage where he was abused regularly, freely admitted to each of the 38 murders he was convicted of and was suspected of almost double that number. His victims, all female, were lured under the guise of working for the anti-child abuse organization he managed and brutally beaten, raped, and murdered. When asked why he committed the murders, he claimed to have done it as payback against women as a whole for being imprisoned on a false charge of rape. I will reiterate again many times that none of the backstories and horrific childhood abuses these killers suffered justifies the atrocities against innocent women they committed. But I will state that if I was tasked with creating violent, psychopathic men, an abused boy with no father figure whose mother abandoned him and who was later falsely accused of rape and sent to prison for it, would be a pretty good starting point. Over and over, in researching these types of violent female lust killer psychopaths, recurring themes pop up. Parental abandonment, child physical, mental, and sexual abuse, themes of incest, particularly physical and or emotional incest between a mother and her son, severe emasculation in the form of the mother emasculating her son, and in extreme cases, this emasculation often involves a spectrum of emasculation ranging from A, the mother comparing a young adolescent boy to his absent father negatively and blaming him for the perceived crimes of his father. B, extreme smothering of an adolescent boy by his mother so that he learns to become dependent on his mother in such a way that he can barely conceive of an independent reality for himself apart from her. Very often in this scenario, the mother will allow her son, with her help, to inch closer and closer towards independence and freedom, and then purposefully and suddenly attempt to derail his efforts right when he's on the cusp of realizing them, in a type of gendered mother-on-son Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This, when done correctly, has a devastating effect on a young adolescent male's development and is designed to literally cause an addiction to the mother. It's essentially a form of perpetual emotional breastfeeding in which the mother can deprive her son whenever she wants, knowing that he is so dependent on her sustenance that he will never be able to wean himself off of her. And C, literal emasculation, where the mother will make her adolescent son watch her have sex with other men, or will force her son to cross-dress in hopes of encouraging him into transvestism. Now, unfortunately, because these accusations will inevitably be made here, I will stress that I don't see anything inherently wrong with trans persons or transvestism. I do not say this as an attempt to frame transvestism as an inherent immorality, rather to stress the fact that there can exist in our extremely complex and nuanced world individuals who would wish to live as a trans person voluntarily and of their own accord, and other individuals who do not and will never wish but are in fact forced by their guardians or parents against their will. And in such cases, specifically with mothers who subject boys to such abuse, the unfortunate and all too often inevitable result later in life is extreme hatred of the female sex for the abuse his mother subjected him to. Hatred can in fact be cultivated. Sexual confusion, purposely visited on a child by his parents, can spell the difference between a psychopath or a sociopath becoming a high-powered CEO who creates wealth or life-changing inventions, or a psychopath with a lifelong axe to grind against the entire female sex. And in a bit, I'm going to talk about more notable examples, specifically regarding mothers emasculating their sons by forcing them to dress as girls. But before that, I wish to really try my best to explain what I'm attempting to say here. First, psychopaths are individuals who display a certain set of behaviors that are seemingly devoid of empathy and concern for their fellow human beings. Many serial killers are in fact psychopaths, but this type of absolutism does not serve us well when it comes to truly understanding the scope of the problem. Second, in order to understand the problem, we are better served by understanding precisely what a psychopath means, and more importantly, understanding that there exist many types of different psychopaths. And furthermore, that people we label as psychopaths can better be described as not being incapable of empathy, but as not being capable of empathy on anywhere near the level that normal individuals are capable of. The implication is a disturbing one in that if we admit to ourselves that psychopaths are simply individuals that are extremely lacking in things such as empathy in comparison to us, we must also admit that we too, as the individuals that constitute the average, have a little bit of a psychopath in us as well. In other words, there are psychopaths that become CEOs and stockbrokers, there are psychopaths that become drifters and serial murderers and rapists, and there are also, quote, normal non-psychopaths who become CEOs and stockbrokers, and normal non-psychopaths who become serial rapists and murderers. Even this statement is technically false, and it is more accurate to simply state that the people we call psychopaths are just extreme examples of the default human condition. We are all a little psychopathic. Some are just a lot more so than others in certain key categories. In fact, there exists evidence that psychopaths are much more likely to be psychopaths of the CEO and stockbroker variety than of the serial murdering and raping variety. The PCLR test for measuring psychopathy is designed in such a way that one is issued a psychopath score instead of just a blanket characterization of a psychopathic individual for this very reason. An individual can be viewed as having certain traits and characteristics of psychopathy and certain traits that are not so. And this test is, of course, not perfect. There is, in fact, a lot of controversy surrounding this test. I'm not here to champion it specifically as the end-all be-all of measuring psychopathy. What I am saying is that if we are ever to devise a truly accurate tool in measuring psychopathy, I believe that this aspect of the PCLR, one in which one can have a set of characteristics that measure levels of psychopathy rather than splitting all of humanity into a blanket classification of either normalcy or psychopathy, will serve us a lot better going forward. Efforts to determine the prevalence of the, for lack of a better word, functional or, quote, good psychopath in comparison to the non-functional raping and murdering psychopaths have been attempted, and the results were interesting to say the least. A 2005 study by Surrey University in the UK administered this PCLR test to high-level British business executives and senior business managers, while also administering the same test to criminal psychiatric patients at the Broadmoor Special Hospital, which houses some of the UK's most dangerous and depraved criminals. The study concluded that, quote, 3 out of the 11 personality disorders were more common in the senior business managers than in the criminal psychiatric patients. These were histrionic personality disorder, that is, superficial charm, insincerity, and manipulation; narcissistic personality disorder, that is, grandiosity and lack of empathy; and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, that is, perfectionism, excessive devotion to work, rigidity, dictatorial tendencies, etc. Of the other 8 personality disorders tested for, and those were antisocial, borderline, dependent, passive-aggressive, paranoid, schizotypal, schizoid, and avoidant, the criminal psychiatric patients outscored the senior business managers. Not surprisingly, the senior business managers were less likely to express physical aggression, impulsivity, and antisocial paranoid tendencies. End quote. So studies such as these, I think, beg the question of whether or not we can coexist with persons that are psychopathic, and whether or not certain types of psychopaths are beneficial to our society as a whole, as counterintuitive as that statement may initially seem. These types of studies also suggest that because there are varying types of psychopathy, we are better served as a society by encouraging behaviors that create, if possible, good psychopaths and discouraging behaviors that create bad ones. And thus, again, we arrive at the question of the role of parenthood, both motherhood and fatherhood, and to what degree parental performance can push a psychopath toward good psychopathy or bad psychopathy of the violent, murderous, and rape-prone kind. Now, in cases being misconstrued that there is no inherent difference whatsoever between, quote, normal people and psychopaths, I assure you that I am most certainly not making this claim. The evidence suggests that certain behavioral and genetic traits are simply different in psychopaths, and that wrapped up in their lesser ability to exhibit empathy is an inherent sense of fearlessness typical of psychopaths that seems to inhibit their ability to process and respond to fear-based stimuli that should, in a normal individual, result in risk aversion. Adversity and risk and danger actually seems to calm certain psychopathic individuals down rather than to distress or disturb them. Studies have been done where individuals who do and do not display various congenital brain dysfunctions, often found in individuals who display high levels of antisocial and psychopathic behaviors, were asked to take the Iowa gambling task. And this is a study where, quote, participants are presented with 4 virtual decks of cards on a computer screen. They are told that each deck holds cards that will either reward or penalize them using game money. The goal of the game is to win as much money as possible, and the decks differ from each other in the balance of reward versus penalty cards. Thus, some decks are bad decks and other decks are good decks because some decks will tend to reward the player more often than other decks, end quote. And in this study, it was found that, quote, most healthy participants sample cards from each deck, and after about 40 or 50 selections, are fairly good at sticking to the good decks. Patients with orbital frontal cortex dysfunction, however, continue to persevere with bad decks, sometimes even though they know they are losing money overall. Concurrent measurement of galvanic skin responses show that healthy participants show a, quote, stress reaction to hovering over the bad decks after only 10 trials, long before conscious sensation that the decks are bad. By contrast, patients with amygdala lesions never develop this physiological reaction to impending punishment, end quote. And of course, psychopaths are in fact known for having distinct amygdala function due to congenital hereditary factors. In the excellent book on the subject titled, quote, The Wisdom of Psychopaths by Kevin Dutton, the lunar landing in 1969 was discussed where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin almost crashed their lunar module into the moon when looking for a landing site. Specifically, what was discussed was the planned landing site was overshot due to a delay in landing from an intermittent program alarm error. Thus, surrounded by geological hazards and quickly running out of fuel, Aldrin turned to Armstrong, realizing their dangerous trajectory and altitude, and with a slight panic in his voice, directed him to get this thing down and fast. I don't need to explain to any of us here the stakes at hand, but Armstrong remained extremely calm and collected in what was arguably the most stressful single situation any single human being has ever endured. And counting the seconds down out loud, he finally found a safe spot to land with only 10 seconds of fuel remaining. Of course, the vital statistics of these legendary astronauts were measured at all times during this lunar landing, and Armstrong's heart rate remained static, barely changing during the entire ordeal. There are certain individuals that actually thrive in high-risk situations, it would seem. And a fascinating study performed on high-stress, high-risk professions such as bomb disposal technicians, specifically the 1980 study performed by Harvard researcher Stanley Rockman, sought to find out what differentiated the, quote, superstars, so to speak, of the bomb disposal field in comparison with their less decorated counterparts. He separated the decorated and less decorated technicians, all of whom commanded over 10 years of bomb disposal in the field, and began measuring the heart rates of both the more decorated and less decorated technicians during stressful, high concentration, and high-risk bomb disposal excursions. What he found was that the heart rates of all operatives remained stable, but the heart rates of the particularly talented and decorated individuals actually began to decrease as the danger and risk increased. These individuals were able to enter into a zen-like calmness in situations where, by all accounts, a normal person would begin to experience feelings of crippling and logic-destroying fear. These types of individuals are what I believe can be considered to be a type of helpful psychopath, completely devoid of fear in intensely stressful and fearful situations. Is it possible that these are simply psychopathic individuals that were raised in comparatively stable environments in comparison to those such as Henry Lee Lucas, who were so abused and mistreated during childhood that their fearlessness and lack of empathy had no possible chance of expressing itself in a positive outlet? Now, I do not put too much stock in relationship experts, but the book When Men Batter Women, written by John Gotten and Neil Jacobson, both of whom do hold PhDs in their fields for whatever that's worth, detail a study on the typology of men who batter women they're in relationships with, and found a similar pattern in a certain type of abuser they labeled as cobras, and another group was labeled as pit bulls. The main difference was in the type of abuse they meted out. Pit bulls were classified as those types of abusers who lashed out in uncontrollable emotion-driven episodes of angered abuse. Think of O.J. Simpson as an example. The cobras, however, were much more calculating and controlled. The cobras were on average more dangerous, not just to their partners, but to everyone around them. They could, for example, instead of beating their wives or girlfriend, threaten to kill their pets. Their anger was expressed in a tactful way with the goal of achieving an end, as opposed to an emotional lash-out designed to do nothing at all other than to express anger and emotion. The heart rate, blood pressure, and galvanic skin resistance of these two types of abusers were measured, albeit in a laboratory setting, and the couples were told to non-violently, otherwise, the study would be unethical, argue with each other over the contentious issues in their marriage. Now, admittedly, this study had a fairly small sample size of only 201 couples, and 63 of those couples had wives that were repeatedly beaten and emotionally abused. So yes, take this study with a grain of salt. But the results are so interesting that I feel it still merits being mentioned and, of course, followed up with more robust studies. But the study found that the more emotional pit bull types actually became more physiologically aroused as their anger intensified, but the cobras actually became much more calm and less physiologically aroused during these argument sessions. Now, of course, the article then goes on to indulge in feminist propaganda stating that, quote, when the police are called in response to violence inflicted by a cobra, they are likely to find a highly agitated woman and a calm, controlled man who blames the incident on his wife, which sometimes results in the arrest of the wrong person, the researchers said, end quote. Now, what they don't say is what is very often the case is that the man is calm and controlled because A, very often the female is the actual perpetrator of the violence, and B, despite being the victim, men know that cops assume that the man is the aggressor, and if they show any type of righteous emotional outburst at being abused, they will likely be carted off to jail, or worse yet, shot to death when the cops label his normal reaction to being a victim of violence as a threat to their lives. Still, The world is, of course, almost infinitely complex and nuanced, and despite the egregious injustice and anti-male bias exhibited in domestic disputes, I believe that there are still cobras, so to speak, out there. Men who actually do enter into the state of Zen calm when exerting abuse onto their female partners in a controlled, calculating way to the point that they actually experience less stress when this is being carried out. This video, of course, does not deny the existence of the female cobra, as it were. I can and will go into extreme and extensive detail in my book about the female sociopath, the female cobra, as it were. Right? A perfect example of the female cobra is the increasing amounts of women that use the court systems during divorce settlements to gain custody of the family pet, only to have them immediately euthanized as a callous, cruel, and calculating way of hurting their ex-husbands. Women can, of course, be extraordinarily violent and cruel, and we will get into just how cruel they can be in another video. But again, this video is about men who are violent towards women and why, so that topic is beyond the scope of this video. But again, my reason for bringing all of this up is because I believe that many have come to similar conclusions about female attraction and how they many times have a penchant for the bad boy, as it were, but I believe this is multifaceted, right? You have women like Robin Givens that are attracted to men like Mike Tyson, whom she would talk about almost apologetically in reaction to his violence, stating that he would hit her and immediately afterwards turn into a crying mess of a man. She said how she would hold him while holding an ice pack to where Tyson hit her, while Tyson sobbed uncontrollably over what he had done. So Tyson, I believe, was the typical pit bull, out of control, violent because of an emotional passion as opposed to precision violence. Women like Robin Givens know that she can control a man like Tyson and use him to protect her against other men, and thus incurring the occasional act of abuse from Tyson was to some degree worth it. The now infamous Barbara Walters interview, where she brought him on like a leash dog to humiliate him, expresses this rather well, I think.
He gets out of control, throwing, screaming.
Does he hit you?
He shakes, he pushes, he swings. Sometimes I think he's trying to scare me. There are times when, or there were times when it happened when I thought I could handle it, you know. And just recently I've become afraid. I mean, very, very much afraid.
Notice how this clip of the interview gives the unmistakable vibe of a lion tamer talking about how far she can push her pet lion before some animal instinct takes over. She is in control. He is a dangerous animal in her mind who is still not beyond some measure of Pavlovian manipulation. But true dark triad traits like those found in the cobras, I think, are a truncated type of evolutionary adaptation to the relentless shit-testing of a woman who never stops. Psychopaths like these cobras function as a hedge against perpetual shit-testers. Women like Robin Givens eventually always run into a cobra after perfecting her craft against the easy to manipulate and control pit bulls. And this, like the evolutionary trick of decreasing stress during times of marital or relationship conflict with women, completely takes women like these off guard. The would-be controllers and manipulators are now being controlled in a cruel karmic reversal of fortune for women that like to wield dim-witted, dangerous men as weapons in their unceasing war of reproduction. They have no idea what to do when confronted with men who are the ultimate passers of shit tests, because those men are psychologically incapable of responding to shit tests, or further yet, actually capable of indulging in them like one would in an act of pleasure. But as promised, I want to now return to specific examples where mothers who forcibly made their sons cross-dress or who emasculated them by forcing them to watch her have sex with other men, and how this almost certainly played a role and contributing factor to their violent acts later in life. Carol Edward Cole, an American serial killer who killed at least 16 souls, was taken starting as early as age 5 to witness his mother Vesta Cole's adulterous affairs while his father was off fighting in World War II. His mother would then beat him viciously as a means of making sure that he wouldn't tell his father about the infidelity. She also had the habit of dressing him up as a girl and forcing him to attend tea parties with the rest of her female friends, where they all joined in to ridicule him, calling him Mama's little girl. In an astounding dereliction of duty, Cole confessed multiple times to authorities about his violent urges to kill women, oftentimes going out of his way to flag down a policeman and directly confessing about his disturbing urges. Once in the 1960s, he flagged down a police officer, telling him about his violent thoughts, and was put into a mental institution where he increasingly described his desire to kill women because they reminded him of his mother, but he was later released in 1963, having been diagnosed as, quote, antisocial personality who posed no threat to others. After later being arrested for attempting to murder an 11-year-old girl in Missouri, he served his time and was released again. Next time he turned himself in was in Reno, Nevada, where he confessed once again to his desire to strangle and murder women, where he was then released and branded a Malinger who was feigning mental illness to get out of having to work. His release was on the condition that he simply leave the state, where he later popped up in San Diego, and within 6 months of his Nevada confession, ended up killing 3 women. His victims all shared the common feature of infidelity toward their husbands, which undoubtedly stemmed from his desire to take revenge against his mother for infidelity against his father. He later murdered one of his wives, and then confessed to all of his murders during the trial. Gary Ridgway, otherwise known as the Green River Killer, and likely the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, was responsible for killing at least 49 sex workers over an 11-year period, and likely many more. His childhood was rife with dysfunction, and he too grew up with a domineering mother and a weak, distant father. His mother, Mary Ridgway, would routinely berate and abuse her husband, Gary's father Tom Ridgway, and at times would literally break dinner plates over his head, with the only reaction from Tom Ridgway being him accepting it and simply removing himself from the room without uttering a word to avoid more attacks. Growing up, Mary Ridgway had a habit of dressing provocatively at work, where she worked in the men's section of a department store, and she would routinely tell Gary in vivid detail about how the men she fitted for suits would get aroused while she was attending to them, even going as far as to describe the smell of their genitals to Gary as she did this. Like many eventual serial killers, Gary had a habit of habitual bedwetting, and Mary Ridgway would take these incidents as an opportunity to berate and humiliate him wherever she could. During these incidents, she would immediately demand that he let her bathe him whenever this happened, and would purposefully dress in scantily clad clothes when she was bathing him, making sure to spend extra time cleaning his genitals while she did this. Gary spoke repeatedly about the simultaneous hatred and intense attraction he felt for his mother, and described wanting ultimately to slit her throat as revenge for never being able to please her. Charles Manson's mother, who seemed to be more interested in partying than child-rearing, once tried to trade the young Charles Manson for a pitcher of beer to a waitress at a bar. Promiscuous and rumored to have been a prostitute, Manson's mother, Kathleen Maddox, gave birth to Charles and scribbled no name on his birth certificate. Charles didn't receive his official name, the name we know him by today, until his mother married William Manson. To this day, his birth certificate reads No Name Maddox. Manson never met his father, and after Kathleen was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison when Charles was 5 for attempted robbery, he would state that his mother hugging him when she returned from her prison sentence was his sole happy childhood memory. After Kathleen Maddox sent Charles to a boys' home, Charles successfully escaped at the age of 13, only to have his mother shut the door in his face and return him to the same facility. He never lived with his mother again. He was later sent to a second boys' school where he claimed he was routinely sexually assaulted by the other boys in the school. Manson was illiterate, and in his first few days of school, one of his teachers insulted him in class for being the child of a criminal. His uncle Bill told him that crying was for girls and punished him by sending him to school dressed as a girl. In 1967, at the age of 33, Manson, whom had spent almost all of his life in either a boys' correctional facility or prison, begged not to be released from a prison sentence, stating that he could not make it out in the real world and wanted to stay in prison. He was released from prison anyway, and a few months later, he started the Manson family. Now, I know that this will inevitably be portrayed as serial killer or psychopath apologetics. I know that the horrific crimes that Kemper and the others mentioned here committed were depraved beyond measure, and people will ask how I can sit there knowing what these people did and have any inkling of understanding or sympathy for these people. And that's a valid question, and my answer to it takes the form of a famous quote on the subject. Nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer. Nothing is more difficult than to understand him. There is value in understanding the evildoer, And one of the reasons that both over time, and much more so going forward, my videos will take on a much less angry and emotional tone is because over the years of making this kind of content, I've discovered that anger, while useful, can only take you so far and will ultimately be fruitless if it is not followed up by understanding. When I see people capable of such depraved acts, I sincerely believe that we are better served by entering into a state of calm analysis instead of blind anger. At least with the latter, we can learn something from them. I think we place such value on normalcy and being well adjusted that we've made the mistake of assuming that there exists no value in the extremes of humanity. I believe that locked inside individuals like Kemper is a prodigious and poorly explored wealth of knowledge regarding the human condition in general. And now finally, in regards to the East Area Rapist, I'm afraid this video is so long already that again, I'm going to have to regard my commentary on him to the second part of this video. I want to share this video with people because it is a very, very small part of the research that I've been doing. I've taken a long time away from YouTube, but I have not stopped researching at all. As a matter of fact, I've been doing more research than ever. In part 2 of this video, I will detail the crimes of the East Area Rapist, and I will then speculate as to why I believe this individual is one of the men who I've described. This will be speculation, of course, since he's never been caught, but we have his DNA. There's still a chance to bring him to justice, and if I can help do that, I'm more than happy to. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for part 2.